Hi, I'm Craig Frazier and welcome to More Cheap Tricks and Special Effects. In this video we're going to be covering the basic effects and aerobrashing techniques used in graphics on custom vehicles. When I mean custom vehicles, I'm talking not just about cars, but also about motorcycles, dune buggies, dirt bikes, helmets, anything with a hard surface that requires automotive urethanes for the painting and clear coating. The paints we're going to be using in this video is the two-stage system designed by House of Color. When I say two-stage, I mean a base coat clear coat system where you first apply the base color, then you apply a clear. What we have listed here are the different base colors involved, as well as a reducer we use to thin them down. While normally they're mixed at a 2-to-1 ratio, we're going to be actually mixing them at a 1-to-1 ratio to account for the increase in thinness we need the paint to be for the airbrush. I also have the paints pre-mixed already in these small bottles right here. Even though these are much too small to use in a large spray gun, they're perfect for the smaller airbrush. The paints we have aren't just base coats, but we also have candy concentrates, which are like pure pigment systems that we can end up mixing with a balancing clear and then create a whole new varied group of colors. And as well, we also have our flakes, and we have our dry pearls that we use to create metallics and pearlescent effects in these base colors. The spray systems we're going to be using in the video are designed by Iwata. This one right here is the RG2 minigun. It's basically a small non-HVLP spray gun that can be used for touch-ups as well as small graphics. While it's a little too small to clear coat an entire vehicle, this gun can, with the fan tip nozzle, clear coat small helmets and Harley tanks as well as excellent for spraying graphics. This thing down here is basically a desiccant filter. It prevents moisture from getting inside the gun. We also have one on the compressor over there you can't see that's making sure we get absolutely no moisture in the system. While this gun is perfect for graphics and spraying and clearing small objects, it's a little bit too large for some of the detail work. That's why we're going to be using the airbrushes over here. The main airbrush I'm going to use here, it's kind of the workhorse of the automotive studio, is the Clip CS by Iwata, same company that makes the RG2. This gun right here is a free-floating head nozzle, which means it can push a lot more volume through than most airbrushes, and it can handle actually some pearls and some very fine metal flakes. It has a Teflon O-ring in it, and it is solvent resistant. So you can use it with automotive spray products and not worry about your O-rings and parts in the airbrush dissolving and breaking down. The other airbrush we're going to be using here for some of the very fine detail work is the Micron C. While it may appear similar to the Eclipse CS here, it actually is a much finer tool and is for very, very fine details. Because of that, it cannot be used for dry pearls or any metal flakes. These will clog the nozzle, but you can reduce the paints down in automotive and use it. For our demos, we're going to be working on white sign blanks. So these sign blanks here aren't just plain aluminum. They actually have a powder-coated white surface on them, which kind of mimics an automotive paint job. So for practicing, they're really excellent. Now, when I got the sign blank, it has a nice shine to it. Just like an automotive surface when you're getting ready to paint on, you really need to knock that shine down. This creates an adhesive tooth that the paint will stick to. Otherwise, your paint will delaminate off later and it won't stay. Instead of using sandpaper, I just used a red Scotch-Brite pad. They make different colors for different grades of coarseness. The red is my favorite for just scuffing a surface. And the whole surface was lightly scuffed. And as you see, we masked off the area. This was not just to give ourselves a nice border for the demos we're going to do, but it also kind of decreases the area, gives me a small framework I can work in here. Now, the first demonstration we're going to be doing is going to be a metal effect. Many people use metal as backdrops to graphics. Some people actually do graphics that look like metal. We're going to do a riveted surface of metal, showing some rust, pock marks, as well as just the standard streaks you'd see in a metal surface, as well as all the shadows, gradations, and indentations used when there's actually riveted surfaces in there. So we're going to be creating a faux finish of metal. And the first color we're going to be starting with is silver. With the base coat systems, you want to make sure you really shake this paint up good. Reason being is it will fall out of suspension. If you use the paint when it's out of suspension, it won't give you the proper effect. At the same time, it won't be as durable. This paint has already been pre-mixed 1-to-1, as I mentioned before, and I'm going to load it right into the top of this Top Feed HP CS. It doesn't take a whole lot. This bottle only holds an ounce of paint anyway, but you're going to be surprised as to how much how much surface area this paint will actually be able to cover. Once you loaded it up, give it a good shake again. Notice my thumb's over this vent hole. If you don't put your thumb over there, you're going to get paint all over yourself, so be real careful about that. And then I always like to give it a good test blast. Make sure it's spraying okay, make sure everything's adjusted fine. Now, to save time, you already noticed I kind of remasked this area here. What I did was I laid in some tape to create an edge, so when we do this metal panel, it's going to have like a peeled and ripped edge on the bottom. And I'm going to keep the area I'm not going to paint masked off. Now, I've already cut this. You see, I drew it with the black fine line pen, and I came in and cut it with an X-Acto knife. On an actual automotive surface, you want to be real careful when working with an X-Acto knife, for the main reason that if you cut too deeply into the paint and actually get into the primered surface, you can actually cause some structural problems and some damage to the paint job itself. Make sure all the tape edges are pressed down nice and neat. You don't want any paint bleeding underneath there. This is automotive masking tape. Don't use the cheap stuff you may find at your local hardware store. The automotive stuff's designed to be impenetrable by urethanes, and it also won't leave adhesive behind. And I'm going to come right in now with the silver I got in here. I'm going to give it a light wash. I'm not going to completely cover this surface with silver. Reason being is the white itself is going to act as a base for the silver and give me a really light metallic look. And you're going to see I'm going to come in here and just fogging the paint. You can hardly notice it, but it actually will give it a metallic look. Now the reason for this, you could come in with a large spray gun like my RG2 and just start really cooking on this surface with the silver. I don't recommend that, not only for the fact that you're going to be wasting a lot of paint, but on an edge that's masked off, you're going to be creating a high masked edge. On automotive surfaces, that high masked edge can actually end up costing you extra clear coats and can cause other problems like lifting or peeling. And with a color like this silver, it's not really, coverage is not that important. We just want the metallic to get down there to give it a silver metallic look. Now, I don't recommend going over this whole surface just randomly like that. The reason being is you can see those modeled patterns that you're creating with the random movement of your airbrush. By going in a vertical format, you're creating like a streak system, because airbrush will cause streaks when you try and cover with it. But with this metal, by going in one direction only and not like crisscrossing and going back and forth, you actually give the look of stressed metal or metal that actually has machining marks on it.
Anytime.
What I'm going to do next is I'm going to come in with black and create the actual seam lines, like pieces of metal that be joined together in an actual structure. And we're also going to be doing the rivets. Now, normally if I used absolute pitch black, just standard black, it would stand out way too much over the silver background. So what we want to do is we want to combine the silver with some base coat black, and that'll end up actually creating a metallic black. We already have the silver in the gun that we used before, and there's a little bit left in there. So I'm going to come in with my black. Again, remember to shake it real good. And I'm going to add a little bit of black to it to give it that silver metallic look we want. But I'm also going to add some reducer. Now the reason being for this, even though this paint is reduced properly, I want to actually increase the transparency of this paint. This will give me better shading characteristics and better gradating. It may take a little bit longer to get full coverage, but in the long run, a few extra steps will give you more of a realistic blend and a realistic shade. Now, ahead of time, I already dulled some tape. What I mean by that is I laid a couple of strips of tape on my pants, and it got some lint on the back. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because if you come in with full-strength tape, sometimes on fresh paint like this surface is here, it can lift the paint. If it doesn't lift the paint, it can also cause what's called flashing, or adhesive marks in the paint. You don't want those either. So dulling the tape saves that problem. I'll come in and kind of crosshatch right in here. So I end up with like some even panels. Let me make this go down a little bit. Nice thing about dulling the tape is it makes it repositionable. It doesn't stick real hard. I'm going to take one more piece and dull it down for this line. Besides taking off any lint on your pants, it's great for removing cat hair, which I always have all over me. And notice how we got an area in here that's kind of not opened up. Well, I'm going to have to do a little cutting with my X-Acto knife. So I lightly come in here and just following my tape as a guide, I just cut these slots out. So I end up with a big cross right in the center of my piece. And what they're going to end up being is the gaps between the metal panels. X-Acto knives are also very handy to actually weed the tape off with. By the way, if you end up with a rough cut, don't rip all the tape off and start all over again. This is a metal panel. It's not going to really matter if you have a couple little bad edges to it. It's going to actually add some realism to it, since we are going to stress the look and give it a distressed look. It's not going to be a shiny chrome piece there. Now, normally if I was painting an entire vehicle, I'd mask these areas off to be real careful about getting overspray on it. In this case, I'm just going to come in here and get real close with my airbrush, and that's another way of preventing overspray. Spraying up here a little bit. I always like, another reason I like the tape out here, it gives me something to spray on, make sure my paint's spraying okay. I'm going to add a little bit more black because I just noticed it's a little bit too thin. Remember, I wanted it thin but not too thin. This is the beauty of the base coat clear coat system. With the base coat, you can always come in, add a little bit more paint, add a little bit more reducer. Also, is something great about the top feed gun, unlike the bottom feeds that you're kind of set at whatever color you put in the bottle. Now come in here and just lightly. I don't want to hit it real heavy because if I do, I'm going to get overspray on both sides of this tape. Well, that tape's lifting a little bit right there. There we go. And I'm just filling in. It's like coloring between the lines with the airbrush, doing a very thin line with it. Showing the versatility of the airbrush. You saw before I can use it for large gradated fades like the silver. I can also use it for very small areas like this cross pattern. Let's see how successful I was on this overspray. Not too bad. I don't see much. A lot of times if you do get a little bit of an overspray pattern, see I can see a little bit right there, sometimes it'll wipe right off. Now we are going to create enough stress marks and streaks in this metal that any little overspray areas you'll have aren't going to be noticeable. And this saves on masking by not having to remask this whole area. You saw how fast it was. Okay, you see how fast this paint dries. Literally, I mean, there's like no time lapse going on here with this video. That's how fast this base coat clear coat dries, which is a definitely advantage over using a water-based system that takes a little bit longer. Now, using the same mixture in here, I got a black. I want to start doing some of my rivets. And actually, I've got a nice rivet stencil here. Got all different kinds of rivets. Some people call it a circle template. I've masked off this one here. Reason being is I don't want to end up having all kinds of overspray from the other rivets. And when you're starting to lay in your rivets, basically you pick out the one area they've got to be at. Well, they're going to be at all four corners. That's a definite must for them. So you start lining them up on like the first corner. You can see through this. I recommend the transparent stencils because you can see through them real nice. And if you can't see through them, like let's say you got an opaque stencil, line up the two edges of tape right in there and then just move in at a 45-degree angle, and that'll give you a good separation. Now, some of these stencils have little nibs on the side. You got to be careful of those because sometimes they hold the stencil above the surface, and that can cause the stencil to like let paint bleed through. I just noticed that on this one. So I'm going to press it down right there, kind of holding it steady, and I spray just on the bottom. Notice I'm really just hitting the bottom, not really the top. Well, the overspray will take care of the top and give you that nice 3D effect. I'm going to come in here and do one down here now. Again, line it up just like I did the other one. And spraying just the bottom. I get a nice rivet going in there. Same one, I'll do one over in here. You can kind of jump around a lot if you like. I recommend doing it this way. Instead of just lining up 8 rivets right here, do all the necessary corners and look at it. When it's done, you'll know if you need more. You can easily add a rivet, but remember it's kind of a pain to have to respray your white and your silver and come in all over from the beginning. A little bit of air from the airbrush helps dry it sometimes. Even though it does dry fast, you don't want to lay your stencil on wet paint. But if you do, remember, you can always make it look like a rivet that's got a nick out of it or something. One of the advantages of airbrush, and one of the things I always tell my students, you never make a mistake in airbrushing, you just change your mind. If you add too many rivets, it starts getting a polka dot effect, so you want to be real careful about that. Also, I want to be real careful about your stencil. See, even though this paint dries fast, you get a little bit too much paint on the end of this stencil, it can bleed through and cause a little nasty blob on your work. So I oftentimes use like 2 stencils. One I'll be using until I notice it start getting wet, and I'll toss it aside, start using the next one, and by the time the other one gets wet, I can pick this one up again, it'll be dry. Oh, one more over here. And that's about it. You know, I could put in one in between each one, but then I'd have to do one in between every single. It would just end up being too many rivets. I want this to stay kind of open-ended right here. Now, one thing you want to add on to this with the rivets, we already have the 3-dimension going here with the dark on the bottom, which we've already kind of implied a light source. This means we have a light source straight up above, shining down, casting this bottom half of the rivet in shadow. We're trying to show that these rivets are kind of oval shaped. Now, another way to really emphasize this drop shadow is using the same black-silver mixture we have in here. I'm going to lightly come in, and I shadow, just kind of do a halo effect around the whole rivet. but a little bit darker on the bottom. Now what this does is this kind of emphasizes the shadow that the rivet itself is causing. At the same time, it shows how when a rivet's put into the metal, it indents the actual metal, which would create a shadow in the indentation. So you're creating more of a realism. At the same time, just say you had a little booger around your rivet like we talked about before with the wet stencil. This would hide it. And I'm going to put a halo around the... What I mean by halo is, notice I'm just lightly coming in and fogging. This is the HP CS Eclipse, and it's a dual action airbrush. For those of you, there's other airbrushes out there on the market too, and the dual action is actually the most important aspect about using an airbrush. Is it gives you the control not just of the paint, but of the the amount of paint and the air, which is almost it's a definite necessity when you're doing this kind of spraying. You need to be able to control the amount of paint. What I'm doing right now is I'm actually just showing like stains. Streaks in the metal make it look like it's aged, and I focus around the splits in the metal and around the rivets themselves. I always tell people if you want to bring realism into a picture, try and bring in reality. We've got our light source shown by the shadows, and then you got to bring in gravity. Well, that may sound confusing. What I mean by gravity is show streaks, like actual water streaks. And these are like water stain streaks coming down from the rivets, where water may be seeping through there or seeping from the crack in the metal itself. Every time you bring in a little bit of reality in what you're painting, it'll end up looking a little bit more realistic. I'm going to fog in this area down here a little bit more. Reason being is we're going to come back in with some curled, we're going to make some peeled back metal here, and I want it to be darker down here so the peels stand out a little bit more. So I'm just going to fog this area a little bit darker. Now at this point, I want to clean out my gun and go to my next color. You notice we didn't clean out the silver because we used the silver in this color with the black. But I'm going to go into a red oxide color we're going to use for actually creating a rust effect. So I need to get the gun really good and clean. I've already cleaned out the airbrush with the reducer and made sure no paint was left in the bowl. And we're going to go on to the rust color. Now, the color I have here is, I call the red oxide color, which is pretty much rust color. And it's made out of House of Color tangerine and root beer candies mixed together. Get a good little test spray here. I'm going to see the transparency factor of it here on the tape. It's not bad, so I'm not even going to add some reducer to it. It's going to be just fine the way it is. And for rust, one thing you want to be careful of is add too much of it. You add too much, it starts looking kind of hokey. So, but you don't want to like just fog the whole thing with it. You want to be real direct. And again, just like I said, put the rivets where they absolutely have to be to start out with. Same thing with the rust. Just don't have rust starting out in the center. Have a couple little areas that are going to be really streaked with rust, where you're going to see rust more than the others, like around a rivet at the base of a seam where water damage may occur. Just like I mentioned before, I'm bringing reality into your piece. Anyone that owns a classic car understands that rust is definitely a reality. You're going to mostly have it around the rivets. And again, you're going to want to keep these streaks going straight down. Reason being, very rarely does rust and water not follow the rules of gravity. So, a little over here too. I just hit all the rivets slightly. Maybe not all of them are going to have some really bad streaks. Some will have worse ones than others, but you don't want to create a pattern where every single streak is the same. That's one thing you want to stay away from. Rust, though it is inevitable, is also chaotic and random. It doesn't happen in an exacting pattern. It's kind of a nice little effect I got going here. I'm going to fog a little bit down here. In that area, we're going to create the furled metal in. And I'm going to create a really heavy area. I want to find an area that I'm going to really just blast with the rust. This is a good way of fixing a mistake. If you had a little blob of paint, let's say you actually went, oh no, I just ruined my piece. No, you didn't ruin it. You can come in with the red oxide and kind of just blob away. What I'm doing here is a technique that's not really that good. It's actually an overkill technique where you're using too much paint in one area and it creates a blowout. But what it does create is that pockmark rust effect you can see in metal quite often. And we really want to hit the rust heavy in here. A couple little pock marks along the edge to show that the rust is just starting to eat away at this panel. About ready to just eat all the way through this sucker. There you go. I never can leave anything nice and pretty. I always got to come in and mess it up with the rust. I personally kind of like this distressed road warrior look though. A little bit more realism, gives it some more character. Otherwise, you see just riveted metal on a car and it's like, fall asleep. Instant Somonex. we go, a little bit of rust down there. A couple more pock marks. What you can also do is what I call the flick trick. Flick trick is, since this is a top feed airbrush, the paint is literally sitting on top of the needle. By pulling back, you're creating the amount of paint, you're creating the volume of paint that comes through there. But if when you push the air down and you pull back, you get your paint. If I pull the trigger back and don't put the air down, the paint's really loading up heavy on that. And if you see that splatter, it actually will create these little specks. Now this is a screw up. Normally I used to flick my airbrush all the time, and sometimes I come in to paint something and blap, get a big nasty splatter on there. But it actually gives a nice effect of that pock mark residue from the rust, almost like some water splattered up on the metal and started rusting like that. Another thing you can do, if your rust starts getting a little bit too orange, don't be afraid to tone it down. Just a few drops of your base coat black, and I'd add a little reducer to make sure it's not too thin with that base coat black, or too thick with that base coat black. Give it that good 1-2 shake, blast it out. I notice it's getting a little darker now. See, all of a sudden you get a little bit of a darker texture going here with your rust. And you do your blowouts again, and you get a really cool little black halo. Really makes the rust look like an actual pock mark where it's real distressed and dark around that area. And this works out good if, like, sometimes people when they mix up their red oxide, they'll use a little bit too much tangerine, and that gives it too much of an orange color, or they'll use too much of that root beer candy, and that gives it almost a pinkish color. You want it to be right in between the two. Not too much one or the other. And that's pretty much all the rust effect I'm going to do with the airbrush. You can go on and keep on playing, but I want to warn you, always stop before you go too far with an effect. It's always possible to do a little bit too much. Less is more in this case. I'm going to clean out the airbrush, and I'm going to go to my white. I'm going to show you how we're going to lay in some highlights on the rivets. Okay. After shaking up my silver real good, I'm going to add a few drops of silver to the white that I've already got in the airbrush. Now the reason I did that was, remember, we've got a silver base. We add a little bit of silver to that black to make it blend in. If I don't add silver to my white, the white itself is going to look like it's floating above the surface. It won't blend in. Basically, in technical terms, it won't have the same incidence of refraction as the rest of the paint. Anytime you deal with metallics and opaque paints, you want to make sure that you combine metallics if you want everything to look like it's on the same layer. I got the thing spraying real nice now. I didn't add enough silver to actually change the color, just to add a little metallic to that white. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to come in and add a light highlight on the top of this rivet. There we go. Just a little bit. Just like a little bit of a dot. It's not in the center. It's just a little bit off center towards the top. Emphasizing that highlight. Emphasizing the light source we got straight above us. Don't make it too bright and too big. End up making these nice, real bright looking chrome rivets that are all covered in rust. You got a little bit of a contradiction going on there. And that's literally enough to bring those rivets right on out. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show a little bit of a separation along this line, like the light's casting on the metal, in which case I don't want any white to get over my crease in the middle. I want that to look like a solid gap in the metal. And I'm just going to use a little business card right here to come in and just fog it lightly. Right along that edge. And all it does is gives me a hard, what I call it, it's like a hard soft line. It's a hard edge, but it's not like a stark white line right there. And even though you may not see it as much from where you're at, when it's clear coated, you'll really see that white, almost like a reflection on there, like when the light's cast on the metal itself. Now the next stage we're going to come into is I'm going to keep the white and the silver in the airbrush, but I'm going to mask off this area down here so I can paint in the furls, the actual furls of the metal. And I got to come in and remask it and draw it out first, and then we'll cut it out and spray it. Before I continue any spraying, I'm going to come in and wipe the surface down real quick. Reason for this is not just to get rid of any finger oils or any of the dust in the room, but also the overspray from the airbrush itself tends to get on the surface. You can see all the paint that's on that's just from overspray, because I really have been touching this very little. And any of that paint that's not locked onto the surface is going to cause a rough surface when it's clear coated. You really want to get rid of that. And I recommend just a lint-free towel with a little bit of water, maybe a little bit of pre-cleaner in it. At this point, the surface is dry. You can always tell by using the back of your hand. It has less oils on it than the front. But you can use a little air from your airbrush, and that dries it off real fast. If you mask off a wet surface, you'll either have the tape won't stick or it'll stick a little bit too much. And what I've got right here is not exactly tape. It's not masking tape. It's a transfer tape used in vinyl cutting. What I like about it is it sticks pretty good without leaving adhesive behind, and it's very transparent, so I can see what I'm doing when I'm laying out a design. This is very important because I want to be able to see. The line underneath I need to trace. Press it down real good. Using this ballpoint pen, I'm going to come in and draw the actual furls. And I have them go from peak to peak. So these peaks I create are actually gaps that are in this metal. Create some three-dimensionality with the furls, like they're actually peeling back on themselves. We created a long one up here that breaks kind of to another one. And don't forget over here, got to have a little bit of a furl on this side going off the edge. It's very important when you have a masked surface not to just confine all your work to the border. Imagine this is just a window you're looking at, and the design continues off to each side. Got those nice and drawn in, and what I'm going to do now is come with my trusty X-Acto knife and cut these out. Again, don't come in and cut too deep. You'll score your underlying surface. This takes a lot of practice. Just peel away the furl. If we were doing a series of like graphics underneath or on top, I may want to keep these pieces later to reposition down. For a lot of movement, a swivel knife is often a better choice in doing this. If you're going to use a swivel knife, I recommend a Ulano, or Ulano, however you pronounce it. Very good swivel knives. It's a little bit tricky to get used to using. And again, I can't emphasize having a sharp blade. A dull blade will score the surface faster than a sharp one will. Just making sure all these edges are pressed down after I cut and peeled all the furls. And I still have my white and silver mixture in here, if you remember. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and respray this area with the white. Now, it may look like it wasn't that dark to begin with, but you have to realize by comparison to the background, which you can't see through this masking, these furls are becoming very white. Now, if you see some of this white revert back to like the rust or the black, it's because the rust and the underlying colors will reactivate this white paint a little bit and kind of seep into it. That's okay. I'm not after an absolute pure white surface. Just kind of building up a nice, even white over all these furls. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to come in with some blue. Make sure it's spraying okay there. And just lightly fog along the top of this furl. Now, the reason I'm doing this is I'm causing a reflection of the sky. You've got these furls peeling back. We're going to assume the back side are kind of shiny on this metal, and it's reflecting the blue from the sky. And we're also going to create a shadow down here below. I'm going to show you can do it real quick just by emptying the gun out of the blue. I'm not even going to clean out the blue, just empty it out. The reason being is if you leave a little bit of blue in your black, it makes the black blacker. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but it does. Something that's also kind of interesting, if you leave a little bit of blue in your white, it makes the white whiter. That's something to do with color theory. We're not going to get into that today. And I'm going to lightly come in and just shade the bottom. Show that the bottom of these curls are not exactly in the light. They're underneath. You know, the sun's coming out from the top. I'm going to pull off the end cap on the brush. It's a neat little trick. Make sure you don't lose the cap. I always lose mine. what you can do with it, you take the end cap off, you can get closer, and you can see these fine lines I can get. The reason I'm doing this, I want to cause some like creases or like little stress marks in the metal from curling around. It's got little stress breaks. And it makes it look a little bit less perfect. This whole image is so distressed, I don't want perfectly shiny, pretty rips underneath here. So I create some distress with the airbrush, these thin lines. We got the lines in there, and so for a little bit of shadowing, I just did a little practice thing to make sure the airbrush is spraying good. I'm going to come in and just shadow right in here to show that this back furl is behind. And kind of add a few little added little stress areas. We got this one over here too, I got to do. Okay, now we're ready to switch over to our white. I have a quick release here which helps in switching airbrushes around. And I'm going to go to my detail gun because I want to be able to create a nice thin white line. Give it a good shake because I already have some white in it. This Micron C operates at a much lower air pressure if necessary than this gun, but I've got the pressure set, so I'm going to leave it. And all I'm going to do is we come in and do a nice highlight right at what I think, my opinion on the apex of this curve is, where the light is really hitting it right on, to create a little bit of that highlight there. And a little bit on the edge as well. And I'll emphasize these edges. You got a little bit of a run right there. It actually will look good with the way it ran in there. Sometimes you have some mistakes that actually turn out to work for your benefit when you're airbrushing. Again, going back to the thing, you never make mistakes. You just change your mind. It may look like kind of a mess now. You can see all this masking tape, and you're like, geez, what the heck is Craig doing? Trust me on this one. It'll look good. This is called the pushing and pulling technique. We've pushed the image back using the blue and the black, and now I'm pulling it forward again with the white. Remember the rivets? Created the depth with the black, but it really punched out with that white. Old illustration technique. You're going to find a lot of illustration and fine art techniques adapt really well to automotive airbrushing. And that's pretty much all the highlights I'm going to do right here. Okay, now we're ready to peel the masking off. Whatever you do, never yank off tape. Even though this is not as adhesive as the masking tape, it still can pull paint if you're not careful. And I always recommend when pulling tape, don't pull it straight off, pull it back against itself. That way if it is lifting the paint a little bit, it'll snap the paint. It won't peel it back. And again, being real careful. See how, look, all of a sudden these things just go pow, punch right on out at you. A little bit of goobers on there. You'll get little paint goobers. What they are is they're overlaps of paint that sat up on the masking tape and then stayed on when you pulled the tape back. And usually it's something as simple as using your finger back and forth to wipe them off. I always tell people to hesitate on using lacquer thinner or any solvents or even scrubbing it with a pre-cleaner. A lot of times that's too much and you'll end up smearing it. Just your finger, a little bit of friction will take those little nibs off. And don't leave them. Little nibs like that will actually create peaks in the clear, which can cost you an entire clear job. Got those all nice and cleaned off. And it's time to come back in with my black. Now as I switch my airbrush back, I don't have to clean it every time. I still had black left in there. Pick a little paint off that tip. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow underneath this furl. A little bit of a shadow here just to increase the depth. Show that this thing's kind of furling over. You want to see a shadow behind there. So we got that nice little drop shadow in there that just shows the furl of the metal actually casting a shadow on the back piece. And now we're going to come in and peel the actual masking system off the bottom. This is a little bit tougher to peel off because it's a stronger tape than that transfer stuff. And I'll have to come in and pick a little bit to get it off. See how the drastic contrast between the original white and the silver we have up here? Even though it looked like we weren't applying much paint originally with the silver, it definitely was enough to stand out. There we go. And again, check for any little tape goobers. You can feel them. I always tell people, don't just look. Run your hand on the surface. You know, make sure your hands are clean and don't have any oil on them. Let's see, I found one right there. Your hand can feel like 1/10,000th of an inch variance, while your eye can only see 1/5,000th. So you will feel things before you'll see them. Okay, and now we're going to come in and actually start laying in the shadow with the black steel on our airbrush. And all I'm doing is creating a light shadow just to show the depth. Makes the white, because before the white was really punching out. What it does now is it makes the white kind of sit back a little bit. Remember that push-pull thing. Pushes the white back with the shadow. And it increases the realism. We got our drop shadows going on here. Okay, I'm going to show you another alternative to the highlighting technique. Instead of using the airbrush, you can always use an X-Acto knife. This is an illustration technique called removal, where you actually scratch the paint away to reveal the underlying surface. In our case, we have a white surface, so it works out really good because we want to create a white highlight. So I'm going to show you how this technique works. With the scratch technique, you want to be real careful to use the edge of the knife. This is for very up close and fine details. And all I'm doing is just removing some of the paint down to the white underneath. And it gives it a rough look, but it gives it that little bright highlight that you would get from the metal itself. This works especially well in real high contrast areas. There's a lot of black involved. It's very difficult to see right here, but when it's clear coated, you'll see it at different angles as it punches out at you. Again, just like anytime you're using an X-Acto knife, you want to be careful not to scratch all the way down to the bare metal. You're just removing the paint you've already applied down to the base color. This takes practice. It's not impossible, but it does take practice. Whenever you're using like what I call mixed media alternative techniques for creating these highlights, you can always mix them like with airbrush. I can come in with the airbrush a little bit and create a little bit of a highlight there. I can also use this X-Acto knife just along the top edge to really kind of just punch this edge of the metal out too, along this side here. See how just going along the edge of the X-Acto knife all of a sudden gives that metal a whole nother dimension right there. Even a little bit up around the russet areas. Just a little picking at it here and there. Again, this is for very up close details. Things you wouldn't necessarily notice from a distance, but you always want to have a nice detail you can see when you get up close to your piece. Coming back with my white again, I'm going to use my final highlights, pull the cap off so I can get some really close detail. Now I'm just going to emphasize on the edge a little highlight that I already kind of started there with the white earlier and with the scratching just now. And what I'm doing is besides coming in and creating a very thin line for the highlight, I'm creating a halo also. What I mean by that is I create a very thin line and then a dot, and I let the overspray of the airbrush work for me by making it glow like it's reflecting light. And again, don't forget to go off your board. Remember, your design doesn't end at the edge. Imagine it continues off the end. And that's pretty much it. And do a final wipe down to get rid of all your leftover overspray before you're ready to clear coat. As you see, we've already finished the last demo and we've covered it up with transfer tape to protect it from the overspray from our next one. In keeping with our metal theme, we're actually going to create a diamond plate pattern. Now what diamond plate is actually metal that's stamped with a diamond-shaped pattern to prevent slippage, to increase traction. Well, it was used very practical as surface systems for like oil rigs and on trucks. It's become very decorative nowadays by using polished aluminum diamond plate. We're going to make this bright aluminum diamond plate look in our effect. Now in doing this, we're not going to be using a lot of freehand techniques. We're going to be using masking techniques And to take it one step further into technology, we're actually going to be using computer cut masking to show how you can use some of the new computer cut vinyl systems for airbrushing on custom vehicles. Now, first off, if you remember on the last demo, we actually cut that brake area to show the furls. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually create a ripped area. It's going to make the metal look like it's actually been torched or torn. And the best way to do that is to literally just tear the tape. Again, I'm going to dull it on my pants and lay that tear in right along here. Don't have to make it even. You can even kind of clump it up a bit to give it an uneven effect. And then taking my tape, I'm going to then fill up the rest of the area I'm masking off. It's a little bit faster than doing it with an X-Acto knife, and it also protects your surface underneath by not using a knife. Anytime you can get away with masking without cutting, I recommend it just for the time factor involved and also for the safety of the underlying paint. And then just like before, start coming in with our silver. This base color silver has to be laid in before we lay in our diamond plate. The diamond plate is going to be a masking system we're going to use to create the shades and shadows and the reflections of the actual stamped diamond surface. But it's got to have this silver base first. Spraying this silver like that, you'll see a lot of, like, I have a snow globe effect going here almost with this silver. If this was metal flake, you'd really see this stuff flying around. Because of this masking over here, very important. Silver is some nasty stuff. I don't mean health-wise, I mean it just sticks to everything. I could have a tank on the other end of the room and this silver would somehow find it. See, I got a respirator here, so you can't say I didn't do this demo without a respirator. I just happen not to be wearing one. Reason being is if I'm wearing a respirator, I can't be talking. Respirators are very important, not just for automotive spraying, but anytime you're using an airbrush. When I'm at my shop and I'm working in my booth, I have good ventilation. I also have a proper respirator. For the video, it's hard to talk, and I don't like dubbing in, so that's the reason I use them. If you're thinking of getting a respirator, I'd say shop around and find one that fits. It's very important to get one that has dual cartridges, and make sure it's rated for organic vapors, and it's an active charcoal cartridge respirator. They don't last forever. They actually have a lifespan of, when being used, probably only a few weeks. And they come in either a plastic bag or a little can that you can put them in so that they're not exposed to the air all the time. If you just leave them laying around, the active charcoal is going to be used up fast, and you'll end up having a respirator that's, no better than a wet rag over your face after like about a week. Okay, a little verbal dog paddling. The silver's gotten nice and dry. And we're going to come in now with our diamond plate, and I'm going to show you how you lay in the computer masking to create the diamond plate effect. What I've got here is a nice piece of vinyl that my buddy Joe Calabresi at Aerographics ran through his computer. And what he did is he designed a diamond plate pattern that mimics the actual diamond plate stamp on the computer, and then ran it through his cutter and cut out all the little diamonds. Now he has already kind of weeded this for me. As you notice, he even left me one that I have to do myself, so I can feel like I've accomplished something here. But he weeded out all these areas so you can see the diamonds right through there. What I mean by weeding is he pulled, after it was cut, he pulled some of the vinyl out of there, and what he then did is he applied a thin layer of that transfer tape stuff we used earlier on the front of the adhesive part. So all we have to do now is pull the backing off of this and turn around and apply it onto our surface. So I'm going to come in here and very carefully, you want to be careful when you're pulling the backing off of diamond plate. You can see the diamonds really well there. The reason being is they'll want to stick to that backing just as much as they want to stick to that transfer tape sometimes. I lost one down there. If you lose one, kind of come in and try to figure out which one I lost. And right there, kind of come in and burnish it with your fingernail a little bit. And then press this down, just like peeling tape off of a painted surface. You can come back in and get that one that came off to stick back on. There we go. Now, this is very sticky, so you want to be kind of careful not to have it roll back on itself. And we want to get it so it lies in here fairly even. Okay, I'm going to come in and line it up and stick it on down. I want to make sure I get this lined up real good with the top. Don't want it off a little bit. Kind of do a little double checking here before I actually stick that sucker down. And then I'm going to lay it in and burnish it down. You don't need to come in with any hard object or a squeegee and burnish it down like you're doing window vinyl or anything. Just get it burnished down enough so that it's going to stick, and you can see the edge of that rip. See the rip that we have down there? You still see it right through there. And at this point, I'm going to peel off my transfer tape. This is the tape that's covering the vinyl itself that's stuck to the surface. It definitely will want to peel off, so you got to see how I'm pulling it at a real drastic angle. Notice the tape doesn't like to stick to tape. It'll stick to the painted surface really nicely, but definitely doesn't like to stick to the actual tape underneath. Every now and then, just keep an eye on it. I'm kind of coming in and catching any of the diamonds that want to flip up on me. Be careful. These don't matter down here anymore. That one does because it's into this picture. But these down here, they're on the masked area. Forget them. Let them come up. Definitely one of those times where a little bit of patience are going to pay off in the long run. Nothing more annoying than having to track down stray diamonds to put back on your picture. Now, the nice thing about this, you can create a stencil, a little stencil you could hold up and do the same pattern, and it might work, but the vinyl definitely works. I got a little bit of a rogue one here. Let me show you what you do. You grab this diamond off of here, and I'm going to stick it on my razor blade, my X-Acto knife there. That way I can come in freehand wise and just lay it in where I want it. Well, that's fine for individual ones here and there. You don't want to have to be chasing down half of them just because you're in a hurry to yank it off. Now this effect right here, I've actually used this tape without the center diamonds to create a different kind of pattern in graphics. It creates an interesting masking system too. I don't mind about down here though. It's laying on top of that tape. I've got one right here that looks kind of goofy. Looks like it slipped a little when Joe was weeding it. So I'm going to come right in. I'm going to reposition it. You can reposition them. It's okay. Now see this one in here, the one Joe forgot? You can stare at this thing all day and not even see that. Totally miss it. I've had that happen to me plenty of times. So make sure you kind of go over your design real carefully. Make sure you don't miss any of those areas you forgot to weed. Always stick these somewhere. I get them all over my shirt and everywhere. And again, going back over, making sure this whole area is pressed down nice. You don't want any overspray getting anywhere. Now, unlike the stencils I mentioned before that you would hold up and spray, you can make this stuff. Once you do the programming on the computer, that's the initial investment in time you're going to make. Something like this for a large-scale area, like if you're painting an entire car, is quite a bit more productive than if you have to hold a little 4-inch by 10-inch stencil and go down the entire side of the car. Now, if you're doing just a small area like this big, then you might want to just make yourself a little stencil and just zap it on out. Reason being is the time you'll spend on the program for this may be a little bit longer than you'd want for a small area. But this is very good for large-scale graphics. And since we've got everything masked off but these edges, we're going to create a very white, bright edge around these diamonds with the white. And we're going to add silver to the white. Remember, going back to the first demo, we talked about using the silver. We want this white to punch out. We want it to also be part of the diamond plate. Because what it is these center diamonds are actually punched forward, and this leading edge right here is going to be brighter than the background area. Okay, now I got my white and silver mixture going here. I start spraying in those little outlines. Now, for those of you that are real perceptive are noticing that I'm using my HP Micron, that C Micron, which I mentioned earlier is for details and doesn't spray metallics very well, and I'm spraying a silver in here. But like I said, it's a very fine silver with white, so I can get away with it. Notice I'm not trying to do very fine details with it, but I already had the white in the airbrush. So instead of cleaning the gun, I just add a little silver. I'll make sure I didn't forget any. Kind of went from left and right, and for a second coat I'm going up and down, making sure I don't miss a single one. If you miss one, it's really going to stand out like a sore thumb. It's going to be like the one diamond plate that doesn't make any sense out of the whole picture. I got my transparent black loaded up in my airbrush, with a little bit of that silver so it blends in nicely. And what I'm going to do now is this white makes the whole edge pop up, and the black, this transparent black on the underside of it, what's going to do is create the shadow that you're going to have on the underlying side of this diamond plate. I'm going to do each one of these. Now I could use a stencil to mask off to get this really accurate, but honestly, in a design this large, your eye's not going to read it. All it's going to read is the light and dark on both sides. Because remember, this centerpiece is punching forward, casting the shadow down, and allowing the light against our light sources up above us to hit the top edge. Don't forget any. It's always good to go back and make sure you don't miss a single one. Okay, looks like we didn't miss any of the black there. And now we're going to come in and we're going to pull off the masking system so we can lay in the additional drop shadows. Again, you want to be real careful in pulling off this tape. Really has a tendency of sticking to the paint, and it can lift, especially with fresh paint. We've had some time for this paint to dry, but just want you guys to be careful out there. And again, I'm looking at it, making sure none of these popped up in the process because I don't want any paint to get underneath there. Looks good. And go back to my trusty black I got in here still. Give it a good shake since it's been sitting for a little bit. And I'm literally going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to come in and just do a drop shadow underneath each individual diamond plate. Now you may think I'm being kind of redundant. I just finished doing this. Well, I did it when it was masked, and since I'm working with a transparent black, you'll still, if I just did it just without unmasking it, you wouldn't see that little edge in there. You'll always see that little edge as long as I don't go pitch black. And I want that little edge to show. It helps in the depth a lot. And if you make a mistake, have this little spit or a blob in the middle of your diamond plate. I don't want you to get lazy and start making mistakes on purpose, but you can always come in and remember trusty rust. You can always come in and do rust streaks and everything. I'm going to actually do this diamond plate with minimal amount of rust and contamination. Notice my air is on continuously. One thing you don't want to do, and I've mentioned it on the other videos, you shouldn't be like, do that kind of stuff. Unless you're sending Morse code messages to your neighbor, you want to be real careful about that. For one thing, it loads up too much paint on your tip of the airbrush, causes a real rough start and stop action, and it annoys the heck out of your instructor and usually your friends around you. There we go. And a little fade around there to kind of darken up the surrounding diamond plate. And I'm going to kind of emphasize the dark edge around this bottom. Remember how we emphasize it on the furrows down here? Do the same thing here. And it looks like I didn't miss any. So now it's ready to come in and pull off the last of our masking system and take a look at how the diamond plate's doing. Okay, back with my trusty X-Acto knife, I'm going to carefully, don't stab yourself on this, remove each of the centers on the diamond plate. As you see, these maintain their original silver from underneath. So while it doesn't jump right out at you, which I don't want it to, you do get the subtle three-dimensionality about it. And we'll just continue peeling these things off, being careful not to scratch the underlying surface. Okay, now we're pulling off the last of these little diamond plate suckers. And just like everything else, they end up everywhere. Run your hand over, make sure you don't miss any. I've done that before. And back with my black one more time. I'm going to darken this edge along here to kind of show distress. I'm also, if you notice, creating some like lines and streaks. This is going to make it look like the metal is kind of warped, like it's been ripped right in here, or even plasma cut, and it's just warped from heat. And come in with the airbrush. Remember those blowouts we did earlier on the rust? I'm going to do the same thing here to create a real eroded, nasty edge where it looks like someone just took a torch to the sucker and the metal's all burnt. If you want to make it look like a fresh torch cut, you can always come in with white along the edge with a little bit of yellow, and it looks like it's still glowing. Kind of a cool effect. But this works. And even if some of it bleeds underneath, it looks kind of good. It looks like a little bit of molten metal kind of creeping around the edge there. And maybe just throw a couple of those little splatter marks in there like slag spit on this thing when it was being cut. Have all kinds of fun with it. I know I promised I wasn't going to dirty up or distress up this metal, but I had to do a little bit of something. That's just me. And come in here and there, just kind of create a few little streaks. I'm not going to rust it out, don't worry. But a few streaks kind of are nice. Snap off the airbrush, and we'll go right into the micron with that white we still have in it. My white's a little bit thick right now, and you can see how you can just go right into the next brush with this quick release. Real handy. And again, just being able to add reducer right into the top of this gun definitely saves time. Give it a good shake. A little bit of a test blast. And we're ready to come in here with our final highlight. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to emphasize this top highlight we have going on here. Just lightly. Like a little dot on that corner. Don't hit it too hard. One thing about white is I always finish my designs with it, so it's definitely a necessity. But if you come in too hard and heavy, too much with a heavy hand, you'll just fry the design with overspray. White's overspray is just deadly. It just will come in and muddy up your whole image. Especially this white, because remember I added a little bit of silver to this white. Now if I didn't have silver in this white, it would actually stand out even more. While you're not going to see it much before it's clear coated. When it's cleared, this thing will all look like it's one solid piece. If I did highlights on it with pure white and no silver, it'd look like the highlights were floating about an inch above it. I'll make a couple of these a little brighter than the others. Definitely stay away from the ones down here. They're not going to be too bright. They're all distressed and burned up down there, so I'm not going to worry about those ones. Ones up on top, maybe a little bit of white fogged in here and there. And there we have it. Now I'm going to come in and peel off the tape. You can see how it gave me a nice rough edge there. While this white's really standing out, I'm going to throw a drop shadow on there to kind of knock it back a bit. Coming back again to my black, a little bit of a test spray there. Lightly come in with a drop shadow. And that just about punches out what we need to give it that depth. See a little bit of this patterning in here? This will happen from tape residue. Now, a way to prevent that, remember we're doing the wipe down, is if right after I unmasked this tape, if I had wiped it down with a little pre-cleaner, a little bit of water, wouldn't have had that little patterning going on in there. You can hardly notice it, and quite often it goes away with clear coating. And we're not done with this yet. I'm going to come back in with this transfer tape, same way we did with this panel over here. But what we're going to do is we're going to mask off this whole area, and we're going to put down something in the background to show you that you don't have to have everything all laid out to begin with. You can add as you go along. If anything, being improvisational with custom painting is a benefit more than a drawback. If you just paint every single thing you plan, you can end up missing out on a lot of great opportunities that you can come up with as you're painting. Some of my best ideas are like when I'm halfway through with a job. So, don't be afraid to change your mind halfway through something. Now this is simple right here. Got my X-Acto knife again, and I don't have to draw anything. Because the transfer tape is so nice and transparent, I can see right on through and just cut along this edge. If anything, give yourself a little bit of, I'm into the black a little bit when I'm cutting. Reason being is if I want to show anything, I want to show a little bit of black. I don't want a white gap to appear after I finish painting everything just because I masked too far in. There we go. Real carefully get that edge of your transfer tape and whoop, a little bit of an overlap. Sometimes you'll notice it may catch there. You may have to come back with your X-Acto knife and cut it a little bit more. Stuff's doing nice actually. And we got one piece left. And there we go. Okay, we're going to go into the next demo, which is actually going to be a stylized version of brains. Some people call them worms or whatever, but they kind of look like brains. Or intestines if you want to get really disgusting about it. What we're going to do is a yellow base on there for the brains that we're going to build up on, and I already loaded my gun up with some yellow. I'm not concerned with the black here on the edge because we're still going to have a drop shadow up in that area. So I'm just going to come in with my yellow, and again, I'm not that worried about even coverage. because it's just going to be a subtle coloring. The most of the design of the brains itself is going to be done with that red oxide color. And actually, remember I mentioned don't do little swiggles, go out in straight lines. That was for the metal. When you're working with something that's more organic, you can kind of be a little bit more chaotic. Has a real splotchy texture to it, but that's actually going to work in the long run by giving a real interesting texture in the background of the brains. So our next step is we're going to clean out the yellow, and we're going to go right to our transparent red oxide. Okay, I got my airbrush with the red oxide in it, just a little test spray to make sure it's spraying okay. And I'm going to start laying out the actual brain design. Now, on the brains, you want a very fine line to start with, and you want it fairly faint. Notice I took the cap off again. And I'm going to start out just with a single line. I'm going to stop it. Then I kind of come out and keep an equidistance from the other line. I create a line that kind of goes around, and I'll stop that one. And what it actually is, if you remember when you were younger and you used to make mazes and stuff in high school or junior high or whatever, you actually don't draw the actual path, you're drawing the wall. Same thing with this brain design. We're actually drawing in the negative space. And I don't want to lose anyone here with any of this long hair artistic talk, but negative space is literally just the opposite of the positive. Positive space would be the actual brain itself. We're creating the folds in between. And we're making it kind of random. Don't go back and forth all the way across, otherwise it has a tendency of looking a little planned. Remember, with this you have a pattern, but with a natural or anything organic, you're going to have a little bit of chaos involved in the actual design. And this one kind of go off and do a little double thing here. Remember, this area is masked off up in here, even though it looks like it's not. As you see, we got the pattern all laid in here really faintly, and they're looking a little bit like brains, but they're kind of rough. At this point, once I get the whole design laid in, you want to finish one corner first, because then you'll end up getting the design off balance. I'm going to come to each of the ends and I create a little dot. Now what this dot in actuality is when whatever this is, brains, intestines, guts, whatever, when it folds around, it's going to create a crease, a series of wrinkles that are predominantly on every end of these little lines. So this gives you a starting point to start doing the wrinkles. And all I'm going to do now, really, after I do those dots all in there, I come in and I start laying in wrinkle. I darken up the lines, of course, too, because I really want to start punching the lines out. And I lay in the wrinkles. And you're going to have a few gaps here and there. That's okay. What I mean by gaps are these areas where there's no brains in the middle. We're going to darken those up. Notice I continue these little lines faintly. I started the design out very lightly and I continue darkening it. Now if I started darkening right away, it may seem like I would have been saving time. But in actuality, I probably would have made some mistakes I would have had to pay for by coming back in and respraying with yellow. By starting out lightly and continually bringing in and darkening when I'm painting, while it may take a little bit longer, I won't make mistakes, and if I do, I can see them and correct them before they really mess up my piece. Notice how from here to this, just slowly rendering and building up layers. And I continue on with the rest of it. As you can see, we got all the line work and the wrinkles all laid in there. And to add a little bit more texture, I'm going to do that flick trick we talked about. Remember, you pull the trigger back, let the paint load up, and I end up with little stipples of the tangerine root beer color all over the brains. This adds a texture, kind of makes it look even more eroded. I figure since I left the diamond plate alone and didn't erode it too much, I'm going to mess these brains up a whole lot. And I've got the red oxide in here. I'm going to add a little bit of cobalt blue. Now, cobalt blue is really close to a purple almost, and I'm going to add just a few drops in there of it. This is the candy concentrate, so you don't need much. And what it's going to do is it's going to actually darken up this red oxide. As you see, we had a little bit too much blue in there. That happens. Just spilled out a little bit and put it back in my tangerine until I could get back my color. Now see, this is the original tangerine. Now I've got, a muddy brown color. And that comes from like the violet blue and the tangerine mixing together. This is the exact color I want. What I'm going to do with this color is I'm going to come in and just emphasize the corner wrinkles and that center area. Still a little bit thick. Again, the nice thing about these top feeds, you can always add a little bit more reducer. Doesn't hurt it. Give it a good shake and a blast. Much nicer, much nicer. I come in and do these little thin, wispy folds right at the end of the creases. Remember where those little balls were we put at the end of the little dots we put at the end of those lines? We're not redoing all the lines. I don't want you to go back and reinvent the wheel by painting over all the stuff you've already painted. We're just emphasizing the creases to make the brain part. We want the light area to come forward and the dark area to recede, which is the gap in between. You notice I jump around a lot when I'm painting. That's just force of habit, but it also prevents me from focusing too much on one area. Whenever I'm painting something that's random and chaotic, I try and paint the same style. A couple more folds in that corner there. And what we're doing is we're pushing back the gap in between these brains to really make them, to give it a rounded look. As you see, we've got all of the dark lines finished in there, and I got a little bit of white in my micron now. And all I'm going to do is come in very lightly. You see, it's almost like a little squiggle. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a slight highlight on the very apex of the curve of these brains, guts, whatever you want to call it. Every now and then clearing the tip to make sure it doesn't spit at me. Even though, in this case, any spitting with the airbrush actually look kind of good. But what it gives is that almost a glistening, wet look. These brains. I don't mean to gross anybody out here, but we are trying to get an effect. So every now and then blow the airbrush out, because what happens when you're airbrushing very fine details like this up close, you'll have a tendency of building up layers of paint on the needle, and eventually they'll build up so big they'll actually just blow off as a big spot. So I always take a little break and kind of blow it off. One additional use for that masking tape all around your piece. And we're going to do these to all the brains. All of them right in the center is going to have this nice little wet highlight. You can kind of hear it when it's about ready to spit. The sound of the air will either start whistling or change pitch on you. And watch out. That means something's going to happen. Okay, we finished up all the highlights in here, and one of the last steps we're going to come in with is the black again. I actually just add a little bit of black to that transparent cobalt blue tangerine color we were using, and all I'm doing is very lightly coming in and putting that drop shadow back in, because we kind of lost it with the yellow and with the highlights. Not too dark. I don't want to make it pitch black. Remember, a shadow is not necessarily black. It's just the same color as what's there, just a little bit less light. Now we're going to pull back the masking tape and see what we've got underneath. You should have a nice broken edge or cut edge of that diamond plate over the brains. There we go. I'm going to come back with my white, the final step, for some real thin little highlights just along the edge. Just break that metal away from there since it's a little dark. I'm going to add a little bit of reducer to the white that I already had. I want it to be real thin. Anytime you need your paint to be very clean and spraying and very fine in detail, you don't want it to also be very thin. Otherwise, you'll have a tendency of spitting. And I don't need much white, so come in along here and just very lightly, a little bit of an edge. Every now and then give it a little bit of a highlight, a little bright spot. I don't want a consistent line. The reason being, this is like a broken, rough edge, and so the light reflected along the edge of it is not going to be even. It's going to be broken as well. And again, I'm jumping around to prevent myself from creating a pattern in the lines. You don't want it to look like some Morse code message. And there we go. No little tape edges or anything showing through. Give the surface a nice good wipe down with your damp towel, a little bit of pre-cleaner on it. Now we got a little bit of something right there. You can probably see that in the camera. I'll show you how to fix that. I don't know what that is actually. Looks like I had something on my hand maybe. We'll show you how to do a real quick fix on this. We got some black in there, that black mixture we had with the cobalt blue in it. And we're just going to darken this line up again, right over that little screw up. Wasn't a screw up, remember. Just hadn't finished in this area yet. Never let them see you sweat. There we go. And before I put away my black, I'm going to do a little once over to make sure I got every single little dark fold the same darkness or close to it. Don't want any areas a little bit lighter than the others. And that's it. We'll call it a day on this demo. And there's your realistic brains under diamond plate.
Yeah, we gotta find it. Very nice.
As you can see, we're back to that first demo again. I want to show you an example on how, even though we finished this demo, you can always come back and add a little something to it. We had the brains we had underneath this diamond plate, so I figured it only fair to add a little something underneath the ripped metal. Now, I already cut this with my X-Acto knife. And remember, we originally had it masked to begin with to protect it from the overspray. And that's going to work out good because now we have it masked off so we can spray an effect underneath. Let me come in here. I got a little bit of something hanging on right in here. I'll come in here and recut that. Happens every now and then. Wherever you have the overlap, sometimes one of the layers will stay behind. Make sure that's pressed down real good. And the effect we're going to do in the backside of this is going to be like a green marble or a malachite looking type stone. We're not going to come in and do it like with granite with a stippled texture like in the first video we did. But what this is going to be is just like a smooth flowing marble. And we're going to do it with what it is it's got a candy organic green with a little bit of white in it. So I've got almost a mint, opaque mint color. And I'm just going to start spraying. And notice I'm not going in the same direction as I went with the metal. I'm kind of just going at a different angle almost. Well, I don't want if I make the marble streaks vertical just like the metal, I'll end up creating a stone that looks like it's almost like precision engineered or machined to match the metal right underneath it. I want this to kind of contrast the metal. And I'm not painting it solid green. I want the streaks to show, What I am doing is making sure that none of the pure white is showing underneath anymore. Just like that. I finished up with the white and green on the base of the marble. I'm going to come in now with my transparent green. The reason being is I want the transparent green to build up light layers to emphasize the details in the stone. The nice thing about the transparent green is it doesn't dominate the design itself. It just continually builds up colors and layers, but allows the underlying mint color I have in there to kind of show through still. What I'm doing now is creating the veins in the marble. Darken up a few areas, keeping some areas light. Another nice thing about the transparent green over opaques is that it builds up depth. I'm really going to hit it hard underneath the shadow. Kind of use this transparent green to also create a shadow. It also eliminates a lot of overspray. Remember, see all the overspray that was underneath here? That transparent green just kills it, and that's good. You don't want your overspray to muddy up your piece. And whenever you get some, come in with a transparent candy and you can kill it. Switching over to my Micron C and my white, I'm going to come in and do some very, very thin white lines, like the thin mica veins that you'll see in some types of marble. I'm not going to do them real faded. I'm going to do them really, really very thin and wispy, almost dragging the airbrush along the surface. You can almost hear it dragging, because I want this lines to be very thin and wispy. What these are, the stratified layers of mica you often see inside of marble. Really gives marble its personality. Again, don't make these too orderly. Marble is a natural element, so it's going to have a little bit of chaos involved in its design, a little bit of randomness. I don't want it to be too much white, because I'm going to use white later for highlights. So if I get too much white, I'll be like killing my highlights later on. I've got the white veins in here now, and we're going to proceed to mask off an edge to create what looks like a bezel or a beveled edge to the stone. And I got my dulled tape again. I'm going to lay it in approximately about the same width away from the edge as the width of the tape. Instead of laying in two pieces of tape, I'll just fake it right like that. And I got another piece down here on my pants. And lay this one in. And then I'll lay this one in right here. You can eyeball it at this point. If you're doing a series of pieces where you have to have, some severe accuracy with your bezels on your stone, then I recommend measuring it off. I just did a little extra masking right here to prevent overspray. And I will come in with my X-Acto knife now and trim off this bottom piece, throw it up here for a little added masking protection. And the same with this piece right here. I'll just be careful not to get up in here with the paint. Still have that little business card here I'm going to use for some masking to mask off some areas. And we set up earlier our light source was straight above. I'm going to change this now and say our light source is off to the right a little bit. Reason being is I want to you got to create a hierarchy of light sources. If I have the light source straight above, this side and this side of the bevel are going to be the same, and that kind of takes away from your character of your piece. So I'm going to make this side the darkest. Actually, these two are going to kind of fight for being the darkest. This is the underside, so it's actually going to be the darkest. Second darkest, and then this will be lighter because the light source is up in here. And the way I'm going to do that is by laying the card in at a 45-degree angle right here. I could lay a piece of tape in there if I wanted to, but easier to do with the card. And I come in and hit that edge real hard to create that little bezel edge there. Then I fog lightly over this whole area here to make sure I get at least enough paint here to make this punch out. I'll kind of even come in and mimic some of those grain techniques I did earlier. And don't forget this side over here. Don't want to mess that side up. Line up your little business card or your masking tape, whatever you want to do. And create that bezel there. And I will come in, fog a little bit right along this one to have this part stand out. And I'm going to hit this real nice and good too. You saw how simple that was. Pull the tape away, and you get a nice three-dimensional look. Bam, right off the bat. Now to really make this punch some more, we're going to want to add some highlights in here. So I'm going to really quick switch over to my Micron. It still has that white in there. Give it a good shake. Make sure that paint doesn't settle on you, otherwise it'll spit and start acting kind of goofy. And I got my little business card here again. And right here on this edge, I'm going to kind of hit some white right here to really make this side punch out a little bit more. I'll even do a little something down here. Make this one kind of stand out pretty good too. Don't be afraid to continue a vein right through it. Remember, the veins do continue all the way through. I kind of killed a couple of them. Come back in, you can bring them in. Just be careful not to lighten that area up too much. A little bit of light there. A little bit of light in here. Just a few areas to make that edge really kind of stand out a little bit more than it already has. Now I have that pure green in here still. Yeah. There we go. Some of that pure green. I'm going to add a few drops of black. Kind of darken it up. Just like I did with the cobalt blue and the tangerine mixture on the brains. How nice and dark I got that green. And then come in right underneath these furrows that I have here and reintroduce those drop shadows. Just like that. Now give it a few seconds to dry, and we can come right in and peel off this masking system. And be careful, you don't want this tape flopping back and hitting your surface if the paint's still wet. The advantage of pulling tape when paint's still wet is you won't end up with a sharp edge when the paint dries. It'll partially dry, but when the paint's still wet and you pull the tape, the paint will actually fall back over on that edge. And I don't really have any areas I need to clean up any. I kind of want to just keep it like that and call it a day on this one particular demo. After we get it all unmasked, we give the demo one final wipe down with some water and a little bit of pre-cleaner, and we're ready for the clear coat. And that concludes the second installment of Cheap Tricks and Special Effects. We've given you a lot of information here on certain effects and airbrushing tricks you can do in the automotive industry, but these tricks and techniques can also be applied to other applications, such as the helmets, even t-shirts, and wall murals. Basically, I hope you gave you a good foundation that you can work with and use your own imagination and ingenuity to come up with your own designs and your own cheap tricks and special effects. Thank you.